winter of 1899 brought Kansas the most punishing cold ever recorded. Temperatures plunged to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, and snow swallowed entire homesteads for months on end. But in the small town of Hayes, something far more chilling than the weather was taking place hidden behind the locked doors of the Parker Brothers warehouse. When spring finally broke and the snow began to melt, investigators stumbled upon irregularities in the county death records, discrepancies that would haunt Hayes for decades. More than 300 families were reported dead during that brutal season, yet only 47 bodies rested in the town cemetery. The rest had simply vanished. What the Parker brothers were burning in their massive industrial furnaces wasn't just wood or coal. It was evidence of the most organized and cold-blooded crime spree in Kansas history, all cloaked under the guise of Christian charity and neighborly service. Before we uncover the disturbing truth about Thomas and Samuel Parker's activities during those frozen months, you should note this story contains details buried in county archives for over a century. If you're drawn to true crime tales that blur the line between fact and legend, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments which state you're tuning in from. I'd love to see how far this story travels. The documents I'm about to reveal were found in a water-damaged basement in the Hayes County Courthouse. What they expose will forever change the way you think about survival, desperation, and the darker side of human nature. At the start of 1899, Hayes, Kansas was a thriving railroad town of about 8,000 people. They had endured harsh winters before and prided themselves on their tight-knit community and Christian values. Positioned along the Kansas Pacific Railway, Hayes enjoyed steady prosperity and a flow of settlers eager to claim their piece of the American frontier. Main Street bustled the general store, the bank, 3 churches, and businesses that supported the surrounding farms. But Hayes also stood on the edge of the unknown. Just 30 miles west began the empty lands, vast stretches of prairie where homesteaders lived in sod houses or crude shanties, often miles apart, relying entirely on their own grit and occasional supply runs to survive. Thomas and Samuel Parker arrived in Hayes in 1894 with enough money to buy a large warehouse on the town's outskirts. In their early 30s, they presented themselves as ambitious businessmen eager to serve the growing community. Thomas, the elder, was tall and lean, with prematurely gray hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to measure the worth of everything. Samuel, shorter and spare, had calloused hands and a constant smile that never reached his eyes. Their business was straightforward and essential. They provided cleaning and estate services for families struck by tragedy. If a homesteader died from an accident, illness, or the harsh frontier life, the Parker brothers handled everything: body removal, property inventory, selling belongings, cleaning the homestead, and preparing it for new tenants. In an era when death was common and resources scarce, their services filled a critical need. They quickly earned a reputation for discretion and efficiency. With 2 heavy wagons, several part-time workers, and one of the few large furnaces in the area, they were trusted to handle sensitive matters with respect. The furnace, initially used to process salvage and burn unsellable goods, was central to their work. But as autumn faded into winter, in 1899, no one could have foreseen nature's cruelest blow in Kansas history. Snow arrived in early November, weeks ahead of schedule. By December, temperatures dropped 2 levels. Even the oldest residents swore they'd never seen. Rail lines became unreliable. Supply runs to distant homesteads turned dangerous. Hayes grew increasingly cut off from the outside world. While most saw disaster, the Parker brothers saw opportunity. They had weathered past winters by adapting their methods and possessed resources others lacked. Quietly, they had been perfecting their grim trade, finding ways to profit to the fullest from human loss. The winter of 1899 would give them the perfect stage. The first sign came on November 18th, when the temperature plunged 30 degrees overnight. Sarah Henderson, who ran the telegraph office, wrote in her diary that she had never seen ice form so fast on the windows. By morning, the town square lay under 18 inches of snow, and winds howled so fiercely that speaking outdoors was nearly impossible. Within days, the railroad suspended service indefinitely. Supply wagons stopped arriving. Homesteaders were left isolated. The Parkers, however, were unusually prepared. Their warehouse brimmed with coal, preserved food, and warm clothing. Their furnace had been modified to burn multiple fuels. They even had the only reliable winter vehicle, a reinforced sled designed for deep snow. As December wore on, desperation set in. Families came to the warehouse for fuel, food, and transport to town. Thomas and Samuel welcomed them warmly, offering shelter and aid. But those who dealt closely with the brothers noticed subtle changes. Mary Kellerman, the town's unofficial record-keeper, later testified that throughout December, the Parkers visited her repeatedly, asking detailed questions about property, ownership, inheritance laws, and land transfers. They said they were planning ahead for the estate work they'd face in the spring. At the time, she found it responsible. Later, would she understand their true motive? The brothers also began making rounds to isolated homesteads, bringing supplies and friendly conversation. But witness accounts uncovered decades later revealed these visits often preceded mysterious disappearances. The Kowalski family, living 12 miles north, was visited by the Parkers on December 14th. 3 days later, neighbors found the home abandoned. The Parkers claimed they had taken the family to relatives in Missouri, but no such relatives existed. As Christmas neared, the temperature sank to -38 degrees Fahrenheit. Families fled or disappeared. Meanwhile, the Parkers thrived. Their furnace roared day and night, sending black smoke into the sky. The odor drifting from their warehouse's sickly sweet scent clung to clothing and lingered in the air. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, the town physician, tried several times to investigate. Each time, the brothers politely turned him away, claiming they were burning contaminated items from homes struck by disease. Given the dire circumstances, Hartwell accepted the excuse, though he noted in his journal, "The odor was unlike any diseased material I've encountered in my practice." By New Year's Day 1900, Hayes felt like a ghost town, once home to 8,000 residents. Fewer than 2,000 remained. The Parker brothers insisted that most missing families had either frozen to death or fled to warmer places. They portrayed themselves as tireless public servants, working day and night to process abandoned homesteads, salvage what they could, and prepare properties for new settlers. But a few sharp-eyed residents began noticing troubling patterns. Properties left behind were somehow transferred to new owners with suspicious speed. Valuable belongings from supposedly deceased families appeared for sale in the Parkers' warehouse, often within days of the reported deaths. Most unsettling of all, the brothers seemed to have an uncanny ability to predict which families would vanish next. The first person to raise serious concerns was Janet Thornfield, a longtime widow who ran a small boarding house near the center of Hayes. Janet had lived there for more than 2 decades and took pride in knowing every family within 50 miles. As the winter deepened, she began keeping meticulous notes on the families who, according to the Parkers, had died or fled. Those notes, discovered in 1962 during renovations of her old boarding house, painted a damning picture of systematic deception. In just December and January, the Parker brothers claimed to have handled the estates of 43 families, from elderly couples to households with young children. But Janet had seen many of them only days before their deaths, healthy, well-stocked, and ready for the winter. Take the Brennans. On December 20th, the family stopped by Janet's boarding house, cheerful and well-fed. Mrs. Brennan even bought extra supplies, describing plans for a comfortable winter. Just 5 days later, the Parkers reported the entire family had frozen to death. When Janet asked to attend the funeral, she was told the bodies were too badly damaged for viewing and had been buried immediately. Similar stories surrounded the Williamson family, the Crosses, and nearly a dozen others. In every case, the Parkers provided plausible explanations, handled the arrangements professionally, and moved quickly to liquidate each family's property. Janet's suspicions turned to certainty on the night of January 15, 1900. While walking past the warehouse, she heard voices inside. Peering through a small gap in the siding, she saw a man, a woman, and 2 children standing near the furnace, looking distressed. Thomas Parker spoke to them in low, urgent tones. Janet couldn't make out the words, but she heard the woman sobbing and one of the children ask, "When can we go home?" She waited nearly an hour for the family to emerge. They never did. Instead, she heard the furnace door clanging open and shut, heavy objects being dragged across the floor. When she dared to look again, only Thomas and Samuel remained materials into the roaring fire. The next morning, Janet quietly asked around. Her description matched the Hendricks family, reported as frozen to death in their home 2 days earlier, when she mentioned seeing them alive the previous evening. The brothers gently dismissed it. Grief, they explained, could make the mind play cruel tricks. But Janet knew exactly what she had seen. From then on, she watched the Parkers closely. Their work was too precise, too fast for legitimate estate services. Over time, a chilling pattern emerged, one later confirmed by witness accounts and physical evidence. The Parker brothers had turned a respectable business into a machine for murder and theft. Their process was systematic. First, identify vulnerable families, isolated, wealthy, or without strong community ties. Then, approach under the guise of offering help, building trust through generosity, fuel, food, transport. Once the family relied on them, the Parkers subtly increased that dependence, quietly cutting them off from others. Their deep knowledge of property law and inheritance allowed them to forge documents and manipulate county records. Well-placed allies in the local administration tipped them off to legal proceedings and title transfers. When the time came, they'd lure their targets to the warehouse under some pretext: urgent estate business, a promised connection to relatives, or shelter from the cold. Inside, the family would be overpowered and killed. The specially modified furnace, capable of burning at extreme heat, erased every trace, body's belongings, and evidence reduced to ash. It was, in a twisted way, brilliant. Their work as estate cleaners explained the constant flow of personal possessions through their warehouse. The ever-burning furnace was attributed to contaminated salvage. Even the sickly sweet smell drifting into the streets could be passed off as organic waste from abandoned homes. In 1978, Dr. Hartwell's long-lost medical journal added another damning detail. Not once during that winter did the Parkers ask him to examine a body. They always claimed the remains were too damaged by cold or disease for inspection, a glaring break from standard practice. The brothers also ran a tight, profitable system for stolen goods. They cataloged everything they kept, later presenting these records as proof of legitimate purchase or salvage. Anything that could be traced to a victim was destroyed. Most disturbing of all were the glimpses into their minds. In letters found among Thomas Parker's personal effects, he described their actions as mercy work, insisting they spared families from slow, agonizing deaths. Samuel's diary, found decades later, suggested he believed they were serving the community by preventing suffering. By mid-January 1900, the Parker brothers had reached peak efficiency. The temperature hadn't risen above -20 degrees Fahrenheit in more than 3 weeks. Haze was cut off from the world. Under those conditions, the Parkers operated with complete confidence, certain that no one could or would stop them. During this period alone, they claimed to have processed the estates of over 60 families. The sheer number of estates the Parker brothers claimed to process by midwinter should have been mathematically impossible. But in those extreme conditions, oversight was nearly non-existent. The courthouse was often buried in snow and inaccessible. The railroad was still shut down, cutting Hayes off from the state authorities. By this point, the Parkers had perfected their selection process. They targeted families with the most valuable property, livestock, and stored goods, keeping detailed ledgers of land plots, herd sizes, and supply inventories. This allowed them to prioritize victims for maximum profit. Their skill at forging property transfer documents was extraordinary, completing transactions in days that would have taken weeks or months under normal legal procedures. At their peak, they were eliminating multiple families in a single week. The warehouse operated around the clock, the furnace roaring without pause, smoke churning into the frozen sky, workers hauling goods in and out at all hours. They had even drawn desperate townsfolk into their orbit, hiring them in exchange for food, shelter, or small wages. These assistants, many unaware of the true scope of the crimes, would later provide key testimony. They described a warehouse overflowing with furniture, clothing, children's toys, possessions from dozens of vanished households. The Parkers handled the items with the speed of seasoned merchants, cataloging, sorting, and setting aside anything of value. One worker, Frank Collar, would later tell investigators he'd been tasked with hauling bundles from the warehouse to the furnace, clothing, furniture, bedding. Officially, it was salvage from homes stricken by disease, but Frank noticed much of it was in perfect condition. With personal effects, no family would abandon voluntarily. There were also areas of the warehouse strictly off limits to workers, and times when everyone was ordered to leave entirely. The Parkers claimed this was to deal with contaminated materials or sensitive documents. Frank would come to realize these were likely the moments when bodies were destroyed. The operation's secrecy was as sophisticated as its efficiency. The brothers created fictional relatives to exchange letters with, fake departure notices for families moving away, and even staged correspondence from victims supposedly living happily in other states. The first crack in their perfect cover came from something smaller, child's toy. On February 14, 1900, a young girl named Emma Schultz was playing near the warehouse when she spotted a small wooden horse half buried in the snow. Hand-carved, its base bore the initials P.B.P. Tor Brennan, the 6-year-old son of a family that had supposedly frozen to death in December. Emma took the toy to her mother, who instantly recognized it. Mrs. Schultz had seen Peter playing with it just days before his reported death. It was his favorite possession. He would never have left it behind. Shaken, Mrs. Schultz took the toy to Janet Thornfield, who had already been compiling her own quiet investigation into the Parkers. The two women began working together, cross-referencing their notes. Patterns emerged. Families who had been healthy and well-supplied, properties transferred with impossible speed, funerals that never happened. They knew they needed allies. Going to the sheriff was pointless. Deputy Marshal Tom Brennan, no relation to the victims, was overwhelmed and relied heavily on the Parkers' reports. The county judge was unreachable, and state officials were swamped by similar crises across Kansas. So they turned to others who had doubts. Dr. Hartwell, troubled that he'd never been called to examine a single body. Mary Kellerman, the meticulous record-keeper who had fielded the brothers' unusual questions about inheritance law. Quietly, they formed a small investigative circle, meeting in secret, comparing evidence, and piecing together the truth. Each brought something critical. Hartwell confirmed the medical inconsistencies. Kellerman tracked the suspicious legal irregularities. Janet documented the brothers' movements and routines. Mrs. Schultz provided personal histories of the missing families. Together, they built a timeline that dismantled the Parkers' official story. No bodies, no proper burials, property and possessions disappearing overnight. And at the center of it, all the ever-burning furnace and the two men who controlled it. Their theory was horrifying, but the evidence fit too well. The Parker brothers weren't caretakers of the dead. They were the cause of the deaths. The group debated whether to wait for spring and outside help, or act immediately to stop further killings. The decision came swiftly when they learned the brothers planned to visit the Kowalski family, one of the last isolated homesteads in the area. On the night of February 22, 1900, Hartwell and Janet followed the brothers' sled across the snow, staying just far enough back to remain unseen. They watched as the Parkers arrived at the Kowalski homestead at sunset, their sled loaded with supplies. The family, cut off for weeks, welcomed them eagerly. Inside, the lamps burned late into the night. Around midnight, the brothers emerged with the Kowalskis in tow, parents and 3 children, bundled against the cold, carrying personal belongings. The Parkers loaded them into the sled and headed toward town. Hartwell and Janet followed, expecting to see the family delivered to safety in Hayes. Instead, the sled turned not toward Main Street, but directly toward the Parker brothers' warehouse. The Kowalski family was led inside, and the warehouse doors locked tight. Dr. Hartwell and Janet waited in the shadows for hours, their breath freezing in the air, eyes fixed on the silent building. But dawn came, and there was still no sign of the family. The only activity was the relentless roar of the furnace burning hotter, louder, more fiercely than either of them had ever seen before. Convinced they had just witnessed the abduction of the Kowalskis, they raced back to town to alert the others. Waiting for spring was no longer an option. They had to act immediately, or more lives would be lost. The small group of investigators agreed. They would confront the Parker brothers directly, armed with their collected evidence and the urgency of the Kowalskis' disappearance. They approached the warehouse the morning of February 23, 1900. Thomas Parker met them at the door, calm and composed as ever. When questioned, he claimed the Kowalskis had been suffering from severe frostbite and malnutrition. He and Samuel, he said, had taken them to relatives in Junction City. For every accusation, Thomas had a tidy, reasonable-sounding answer dismissed the group's evidence as misunderstandings and coincidence. But then Dr. Hartwell noticed something: dark stains on Thomas's clothing. When asked, Thomas replied casually that it was animal blood from butchering livestock. Hartwell, with decades of medical training, knew better. The texture, the pattern, it was human blood. The tension spiked when Janet demanded entry to the warehouse to search for the Kowalskis. Thomas refused, citing contaminated materials and health risks. His refusal only deepened their certainty. Something terrible was inside. Blocked at the door, the group went to Deputy Marshal Tom Brennan, presenting their findings and pressing for immediate action. Brennan was skeptical at first, but the sheer weight of the evidence and the urgency finally convinced him. 2 days later, on February 25, 1900, Brennan, Hartwell, and 3 armed volunteers forced their way into the Parker brothers' warehouse. What they found would haunt Kansas for generations. The main hall was lined wall-to-wall with personal belongings, clothing, furniture, tools, children's toys, all meticulously organized and tagged. Each item had a label, an inventory number, and sometimes a note about its value on another room. They found the brothers' records, detailed property maps, lists of every family in the area, their assets, vulnerabilities, and projected yields. There were files on nearly every household in Hayes County, down to livestock counts and food stores. Then came the most disturbing room: jewelry, family photographs, Bibles and rosaries, lockets with initials engraved, items that no family would ever willingly abandon, all sorted, cataloged, and priced. Finally, they reached the furnace area and, with it, the truth. The furnace had been heavily modified to burn at extreme temperatures, high enough to reduce a human body to ash. Around it lay bone fragments, scorched scraps of clothing, and other remains. Hartwell collected samples for examination. His conclusion was undeniable: human remains, from multiple victims, both adults and children. He estimated that the furnace had consumed dozens, perhaps over 100 bodies. During that winter alone, In a locked side room, they found the Kowalskis' belongings, the children's toys, the parents' coats recently sorted and tagged, ready for processing. But the discovery that cemented the brothers' guilt was Samuel Parker's journal. Inside were meticulous notes, methods, timelines, even their justifications. Over the years, they had refined their system to near perfection. They saw themselves not as killers, but as practical men, providing mercy in harsh times. When confronted with the evidence, the Parkers clung to their story of legitimacy. But the physical proof was overwhelming. Eventually, Thomas broke, offering a partial confession in exchange for his brother's life. In that confession, the full scope of the horror emerged. 47 families, roughly 200 victims. At first, the brothers targeted those already close to death from cold or starvation. But greed soon replaced mercy. Healthy, prosperous families became their prey. Their method was chillingly consistent. Lure the family to the warehouse with promises of help. Overpower them, usually with suffocation or blunt force to minimize blood, and burn the bodies within hours. Possessions were cataloged for resale. Any traceable items destroyed. False documents and forged correspondence ensured no questions would be asked. Samuel later admitted in his own statements that the killings had become routine, another part of their business. They convinced themselves they were sparing people from slower, crueler deaths. The trial of Thomas and Samuel Parker became one of the most infamous in Kansas history. The evidence, bones, documents, eyewitness accounts, was irrefutable. Both were convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death. The case sent shockwaves through the state and beyond, not just for its brutality, but for its precision. The Parkers hadn't acted out of sudden rage or desperation. They had built a machine of murder, one fueled by profit, secrecy, and a cold, calculated efficiency, unlike anything Kansas had ever seen. The Parker brothers' trial gripped the Midwest, filling newspaper columns for months. Reporters chronicled every testimony, every gruesome detail. Criminologists and legal scholars studied the case, calling it one of the most methodical and chilling examples of mass murder in American history. But in Hayes, the aftermath was devastating. Nearly a quarter of the town's population was gone. Property records had been falsified, destroyed, or forged beyond recognition. For years, the courts struggled to sort out who rightfully owned the stolen land and homes. The case forced hard questions about community responsibility. How could so many miss the signs? Why had no one acted sooner? Many residents carried guilt themselves for trusting the Parker brothers, despite subtle warning signs. Dr. Hartwell, whose persistence helped expose the crimes, was deeply scarred. His journal from that winter reveals a man wrestling with the reality of systematic evil in his own community. He continued practicing medicine in Hayes, but those months left a wound that never healed. Janet Thornfield, the boarding house keeper who had first voiced suspicions, became a local hero. Yet she lived with her own burden, wondering if earlier action might have saved lives. She remained in Hayes until her death in 1934, keeping meticulous records and watching her community with vigilant eyes. The Parker case changed law enforcement thinking. It became a cautionary tale in police academies and law schools, proof that extreme conditions can cloak organized crime, and that official oversight must never falter, even in crisis. Despite the confessions, the true number of victims remains uncertain. Thomas admitted to killing 47 families, about 200 people, but his records were incomplete, and much was lost to the furnace's flames. Some suspect the toll was far higher. The brothers' pasts remain a mystery. No one ever proved whether they'd committed similar crimes before arriving in Hayes, though scattered rumors hinted at dark histories in other towns. The psychology of the case continues to fascinate. The Parkers maintained their veneer of respectability. While committing mass murder, they wrapped their crimes in the language of Christian charity, convincing themselves they were sparing the weak from slower, crueler deaths. Their manipulation of community trust remains a textbook example of how predators exploit social bonds. On October 15, 1900, Thomas and Samuel Parker were executed at the Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing. Their deaths ended the legal battle, but the shockwaves lingered for decades. Today, a modest memorial marks the site of their warehouse, a place that became a factory of death. It stands as a reminder of vigilance, the protection of the vulnerable, and the need for communities to act when something feels wrong. Even after the hangings, the case refused to rest. In March 1901, nearly a year after the trial, construction workers renovating the basement of the old Methodist church made a grim discovery. Hidden beneath the floorboards was a cache of personal items, jewelry, family photos, children's toys, religious artifacts. They matched descriptions from families the Parkers had processed. The most chilling find was a leather-bound ledger. It contained coded entries dating back to 1897, 2 years before the infamous winter. Decoding it took months, but when investigators cracked it, the truth was worse than anyone imagined. The Parker brothers had been killing long before 1899, at least 15 families over the winters of 1897 and 1898. Those years had been their testing ground, refining their techniques and building their confidence. The ledger's tone was cold, clinical. It detailed body disposal, document forgery, and manipulating community perception. Thomas's entries offered twisted justifications, calling victims burdens, and framing the murders as natural selection. Samuel's notes were more mechanical, obsessed with logistics, profits, and efficiency. Most horrifying were the experiments. They had tested different methods of killing, searching for the most efficient, silent, and trace-free approach. At first, they used agricultural poison, but eventually, they perfected their preferred methods: suffocation and blunt force trauma. Quick, quiet, and clean. It was the final proof that the Parker murders weren't born solely of that brutal winter. They were the product of years of planning, trial, and refinement making. There's not just a crime of circumstance, but a calculated pursuit of profit and power over life and death. The discovery of the ledger forced the state to reopen the Parker investigation and to reconsider the true scale of the brothers' crimes. The revelation that they had been killing for at least 3 years before the infamous winter meant the death toll could exceed 300 people, making it one of the largest serial murder sprees in American history. As word of the new evidence spread, more witnesses came forward. Between 1901 and 1903, state investigators collected testimonies that pulled the curtain back even further, painting a portrait of a criminal enterprise that had thrived through precision, patience, and deception. The most powerful testimony came from Margaret Kowalski, the sole surviving member of the family. Dr. Hartwell and Janet Thornfield had seen taken to the warehouse. Margaret had been away visiting relatives in Junction City during the night of her family's abduction. When she returned in the spring of 1900, she was told they had all died of exposure. Her account revealed months of calculated groundwork. That autumn, the Parkers had visited her family repeatedly, helping with winter preparations and steadily winning their trust. They had supplied the family with contaminated heating fuel that burned poorly, forcing them to rely on the brothers for more. Meanwhile, they spread whispers in town that the Kowalskis carried a contagious disease, ensuring no neighbors came to help. Margaret also testified to a darker tactic. The brothers had been quietly poisoning isolated families with small doses of arsenic, just enough to weaken them, making them more vulnerable to cold, illness, and natural death. Once the family was frail and desperate, the Parkers would offer help and lead them straight to the warehouse. Another key witness was Henry Kellerman, Mary Kellerman's brother, who had worked part-time for the Parkers during the winter of 1899, believing he was doing legitimate estate work. Henry had helped process the belongings of recently deceased families. He remembered the way the brothers sifted through personal effects with mechanical efficiency, separating valuables from keepsakes. Family photographs and documents were studied closely, then burned. Most unsettling were the brothers' conversations. They rarely referred to victims by name only, by the value of their property. Thomas would comment on the efficiency of an elimination, praising how quickly an entire household had been erased without a trace. Henry now realized the bundles he'd carried to the furnace supposedly contaminated bedding and clothing had likely contained human remains. The brothers left nothing identifiable. Bone fragments were ground down and mixed with ash before disposal. These revelations tore through Hayes like a second storm. The fact that the killings had gone on for years before 1899 raised painful questions. How had no one seen it? How had trust blinded them? Churches organized prayer vigils. Community meetings turned into grief-stricken reckonings. Reverend William Hartwell, Dr. Hartwell's brother, delivered a series of sermons on the nature of evil and the duty of vigilance. Now preserved in the church archives, the economic damage was equally lasting. Vast tracts of land, homes, and assets had been stolen, wrapped in a tangle of false deeds and forged transfers. Many rightful owners fought years to reclaim property. Some never succeeded. The Parker crimes became a warning for every frontier town in the West. Other communities implemented oversight rules for estate services and property transfers. The state created new investigative procedures for suspicious deaths, requiring multiple witnesses for certification, mandatory medical examinations, and rigorous documentation for land changes. These Parker protocols would spread to several Western states and remain in place for decades. The case also drew the attention of one of the era's most forward-thinking minds in criminal psychology, Dr. Hamilton Craig of the University of Kansas. Interviewing witnesses and dissecting the brothers' writings, Craig compiled one of the first psychological profiles of systematic killers. His 1904 report concluded that the Parker brothers displayed classic signs of what would later be known as psychopathy: complete emotional detachment, a total absence of empathy, and a view of victims as objects, not people. Their ability to maintain a flawless facade while committing mass murder showed a high degree of psychological manipulation. They were adaptable, intelligent, and organized, constantly refining their methods to fit changing circumstances. Craig also found evidence of a shared delusion, the belief that they were performing a public service by eliminating those too weak to survive the winter. Early journal entries revealed faint guilt, but over time, their writings became void of conscience, only cold efficiency and financial calculation. His work on the Parker case became foundational in understanding how individuals can gradually become desensitized to extreme violence, and how criminals can weaponize community trust. But perhaps the most chilling revelation was yet to come. In 1907, 7 years after the brothers swung from the gallows, another discovery would shake Hayes all over again. In 1907, 7 years after the Parker brothers swung from the gallows, Hayes would face one last chilling revelation. During the demolition of an old barn on the outskirts of town, workers uncovered a hidden chamber sealed behind a false wall. Inside was a macabre time capsule, hundreds of personal items belonging to the brothers' victims. Jewelry, photographs, religious artifacts, and family documents, each meticulously arranged, as if the brothers had curated a private trophy room to their own horrors. But it was the maps that turned this from a grim discovery into a nightmare. Detailed diagrams pinpointed the locations of unmarked graves scattered across the Kansas prairie. Investigators followed the maps to 17 burial sites, uncovering the remains of 43 more people. Forensic analysis confirmed what many feared. Parker brothers hadn't always relied on their furnace. Years before their capture, they had buried victims in remote locations, sometimes with a semblance of dignity, but over time becoming increasingly careless and callous. The evidence suggested they had been killing for at least 4 years before their arrest, bringing the estimated death toll to over 400. That staggering number made the Parker case one of the most prolific serial killing sprees in recorded history anywhere in the world. The graves revealed more than just bodies. They showed the psychological decay of the brothers. Early burials hinted at some ritualized respect. Later ones reflected complete moral detachment. The victims reduced to nothing but obstacles to profit. The fallout from this final discovery rippled far beyond Kansas. The Parker case reshaped American criminal law, forcing the creation of new legal frameworks for untangling property theft tied to systematic murder. Their crimes also changed law enforcement, proving the necessity of community involvement in investigations. The courage of Hayes citizen investigators Janet Thornfield, Dr. Hartwell, Mary Kellerman, and others became a model for civic action against organized crime. The psychological profiling pioneered by Dr. Hamilton Craig during the case laid groundwork for modern criminal profiling, now a standard tool for identifying systematic killers. Hayes itself was forever changed. A memorial park now stands where the warehouse once loomed, its monuments bearing the names of known victims, and its displays warning future generations about the dangers of blind trust. Survivors and descendants still gather there, honoring the memory of those lost to one of history's most calculated killing machines. Yet, mysteries remain. The true number of victims may never be known. Some believe the total exceeded even the confirmed 400. The brothers' lives before Hayes remain shadowed, and whispers persist that they may have committed similar crimes elsewhere. The Parker story continues to fascinate criminologists, historians, and storytellers, not just for its brutality, but for what it reveals about human nature. These were not shadowy strangers lurking at the edges of society. They were respected neighbors, woven into the very fabric of the community they preyed upon. And so the winter of 1899 is remembered not just for its record-breaking cold, but for the deeper chill that crept into the heart of Haza, cold measured, not in degrees, but in the destruction of trust, dignity, and human life. What the Parkers burned in their furnace was more than wood. It was human life. It was the faith that bound their community together. But this is not just a story about the triumph of evil, it's about the power of courage and vigilance. It's about ordinary citizens who refused to look away, who faced unimaginable horror, and still stood for justice. More than a century later, the Parker brothers' case remains one of the most studied examples of systematic murder in criminal history. Its lessons continue to shape law enforcement, criminal psychology, and community safety practices. And as we tell it now, the question lingers: was everything truly revealed? Or are there victims whose names will never be known, whose stories will remain forever buried beneath the Kansas prairie? If this story chilled you, share it with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit the like button to support our work, and subscribe so you never miss the next journey into the shadows of history. Evil can hide behind the most respectable facade. The price of freedom is eternal vigilance. What do you think? Was the full truth uncovered, or does more lie hidden in the cold earth of Hayes? Let me know in the comments.